A black man entered a hotel to book a room, but was immediately rejected by the staff because of his skin color and how ordinary he looked. The staff immediately regretted her actions. What happened? Let's watch to see what happens next. Welcome to H2 Black Thread, where power meets justice. The early evening sky hung over New York City like a vast canvas painted in deep hues of violet and gold. The city bustled with life as high-end cars zipped past, their drivers eager to arrive at the luxurious Evergrand Manhattan, one of the crown jewels of Evergrand Hotels and Resorts. From the outside, the towering structure gleamed with the promise of impeccable service, a hallmark of the Evergrand name. But beneath this polished facade, trouble was brewing. Alexander Carter, the chairman and founder of Evergrand Hotels and Resorts, stood at the curb across the street from the grand entrance. At 50 years old, Alexander was the embodiment of success, tall, sharply dressed, and carrying an air of authority that demanded respect. His empire spanned continents, boasting five-star accommodations that catered to the world's elite. And yet here he was, about to walk into one of his own hotels, not as the revered CEO but as an anonymous guest. The decision to investigate personally had not been made lightly. The Evergrand Manhattan had been the subject of persistent complaints, reports of racial discrimination, unprofessional staff, and guests feeling unwelcome. Though corporate audits and managerial reports assured him that everything was under control, Alexander knew better. Problems like these did not surface without cause, and the only way to uncover the truth was to experience the service himself. With that in mind, he had meticulously planned this undercover mission. Using a fake identity, Nathan Cole, he had booked a standard room, eschewing the lavish suites he was accustomed to. No chauffeur, no tailored suits, no entourage, just a man checking into a hotel like any other guest. He adjusted the collar of his modest navy blue blazer and took a deep breath before crossing the street. The automatic glass doors parted smoothly, welcoming him into the opulent lobby. The interior was breathtaking. Crystal chandeliers reflected light across pristine marble floors, and a grand piano sat elegantly in the corner, its player providing a soft, melodic ambience. To an outsider, it was perfect. But Alexander knew better than to judge a hotel by its lobby. As he strode towards the reception desk, his keen eyes scanned the room. The front desk was sleek and modern, stationed by a single receptionist, a young blonde woman who looked more interested in her phone than the guests. Her name tag read Samantha Blake. She leaned against the counter, eyes glued to her screen, thumbs scrolling rapidly. Alexander approached and stopped directly in front of her. She didn't look up. He cleared his throat. Still nothing. Alexander tapped the counter lightly. With a loud sigh, Samantha finally acknowledged him, her eyes sluggishly moving up from her phone screen. Her expression screamed annoyance. "Yeah," she said, her tone devoid of warmth. "Not welcome to Evergrand Manhattan. Not how can I assist you, just yeah." Alexander's brows lifted slightly. If this was how guests were greeted, it was already a red flag. "Good evening," he said evenly. "I have a reservation. Nathan Cole." Samantha exhaled through her nose, barely concealing her boredom as she turned to her computer. Her fingers moved lazily across the keyboard, her posture slouched. Let's see, nope." She barely even looked at the screen before turning back to her phone. Alexander tilted his head. "You're sure about that?" She rolled her eyes and tapped a few more keys, half-heartedly, without real effort. "Nope, nothing under that name." He knew that was a lie. He had personally booked the room, and as the chairman, he had full access to Evergrand's internal system. But instead of confronting her, he remained calm. "Could you double-check, please?" he asked, his voice still polite. Another exaggerated sigh. Samantha tapped the keyboard again, this time even more lazily. Nope, still nothing. Alexander reached into his pocket, pulling out his phone. A few swipes later, he had his confirmation email on display. I have the booking right here, he said, showing it to her. She barely glanced at the screen before shrugging. Yeah, well, the system doesn't lie. But people do. Alexander inhaled deeply, keeping his composure. He had encountered this kind of dismissive service before. It was not a system error. It was a choice. A choice made by an employee who had already decided he wasn't worth her time. Curious now, Alexander discreetly pulled out his secondary phone, the one with full administrative access to Evergrand's booking system. With a few quick taps, he navigated to the reservations log, and there it was. Nathan Cole booking confirmed. Except something was off. There was an additional entry, reservation manually deleted, and next to it the name of the employee who had done it. Samantha Blake. Alexander's jaw tightened. There it was, proof. She had deliberately erased his booking. This wasn't incompetence. This was malicious. Still keeping his expression neutral, he looked up at Samantha, who had already gone back to scrolling on her phone. He tapped the counter once more. What happens when you delete a reservation? He asked casually. She blinked, caught off guard. Huh? When you manually remove a booking from the system. What happens? Samantha hesitated. Oh, it's just gone, I guess. No big deal. Alexander nodded. And who has the authority to do that? She shrugged. Only front desk staff, obviously. Like yourself. Yeah. Alexander turned his phone screen towards her. She looked, and her face lost all color. Her name, right there, next to the deletion log. Samantha's mouth opened slightly as if trying to form words, but nothing came out. Alexander leaned in slightly. So tell me, Samantha, why did you delete my reservation? Her fingers twitched against the desk, her panic visible. I didn't. Don't. Alexander cut her off smoothly. Her breath hitched. She knew she was caught. For the first time, he allowed himself to smirk. This was going to be one hell of a night. Alexander Carter remained composed, his fingers tapping lightly on the counter. He had spent years building Evergrand hotels and resorts into one of the most prestigious luxury hospitality brands in the world. The mere thought that one of his hotels had staff who actively sabotaged guests was infuriating, but he kept his temper in check. He had to see how far this would go. Samantha Blake, the receptionist, still had her eyes glued to her phone. She had all the posture of someone who hated her job, shoulders slouched, a vacant expression, and an air of impatience that suggested she was merely tolerating the guests rather than serving them. Alexander glanced at the other guests in the lobby. Some sat comfortably in the lounge area, sipping on cocktails, while others chatted quietly. However, a few pairs of eyes discreetly watched what was unfolding. A couple standing near the concierge whispered to each other, no doubt noticing how poorly Alexander was being treated. Still, Samantha remained indifferent. Alexander cleared his throat again, louder this time. Samantha let out another exaggerated sigh and rolled her eyes as if he were the biggest inconvenience of her evening. Sir, like I said, there's no reservation under your name, she said lazily, flipping her blonde hair over her shoulder. Alexander didn't flinch. He kept his voice even and measured. I booked a room under the name Nathan Cole. I have the confirmation email right here. He held out his phone, the booking confirmation displayed clearly. Samantha barely even glanced at it before scoffing. Look, sir, she said, finally dropping her phone onto the counter. The system doesn't lie. If your name isn't in it, then you didn't book a room. Maybe you made a mistake. Maybe you booked the wrong hotel. Alexander's patience was wearing thin. He had already confirmed that his reservation had been manually deleted. He had seen her name next to the cancellation log. Yet she was still playing this game. He knew exactly what was happening. This wasn't a system error. This wasn't a mistake. This was deliberate discrimination. Alexander tilted his head slightly, studying her. "Let me ask you something, Samantha," he said calmly. "How often does the system delete guest reservations?" Samantha faltered for the briefest moment before regaining her arrogant smirk. "It happens," she shrugged. "Sometimes, but it's usually a guest mistake." "Right," Alexander nodded slowly. "And who has the power to delete a reservation?" Samantha hesitated again, then shrugged. "Only front desk staff, obviously." Alexander smiled, but his eyes were cold. "And would that include you?" Now she was nervous. Her fingers twitched slightly, her smug expression faltering for a split second. But then she quickly recovered. "Sir," she said, rolling her eyes again, "I don't know what you're trying to say, but I don't have time for this. There's no reservation. You can try another hotel, or I can book you a new room at the current rate." Alexander didn't let her finish. "How about you check again?" he said, his tone still polite, but there was a sharp edge to it now. Samantha sighed, her annoyance growing more obvious. She reluctantly tapped a few keys on her keyboard, then suddenly paused. Her eyes flicked to the screen. Then back to Alexander. Then back to the screen. For the first time that night, she looked genuinely nervous. Alexander didn't need to see the monitor to know what she was looking at. His reservation was right there. Samantha knew she had deleted it, and now she had to decide how to get out of this. She swallowed hard, then quickly tapped more keys. "There we go," she said suddenly, forcing a smile. "I found a room for you." Alexander raised an eyebrow. "Is that so?" She nodded quickly, grabbing a key card and sliding it across the counter. "Room 1427, she said. "Here you go." Alexander didn't touch the key card. Instead, he held her gaze. "Room 1427, he repeated. "Yep," Samantha said, too quickly. Now he knew exactly what she had done. Room 1427 was the worst room in the hotel. Alexander knew the layout of every hotel in his empire. He had personally designed many of the floor plans. He knew that room 1427 was, right next to the service elevator, meaning constant noise all night. Adjacent to the maintenance closet, which often leaked water from the plumbing. Had a lovely view of the dumpsters behind the hotel. It was petty. It was deliberate, and it was absolutely unacceptable. Alexander took a slow breath and exhaled. "Samantha," he said, his voice lower now, dangerous. "Do I look stupid to you?" Her smirk faltered. I don't." "Then why," he continued, still calm, "are you trying to play me like I wouldn't immediately recognize what you just did?" The lobby had grown quieter. Guests and employees nearby were listening now. A young bellboy in the corner suddenly became very interested in adjusting his hat. Samantha froze. For the first time, she looked genuinely afraid. Alexander slowly picked up the key card. He held it between his fingers, examining it. Then he looked back at her. "Thanks, Samantha," he said softly. And with that, he turned and walked toward the elevators. But this wasn't over. Not even close. The second he stepped into his room, Alexander Carter was done playing games. He pulled out his laptop, logged into the internal hotel system, and started digging. Guest complaints. Samantha's name appeared repeatedly, accused of dismissing guests, ignoring service requests, and even denying bookings for policy reasons that didn't exist. Staff complaints. Employees had noted her attitude problems, yet management had done nothing. Manager reports, or rather the lack of them. There was no indication that any disciplinary action had ever been taken against her. Then he found the reason why. Richard Hale, the hotel manager. The man responsible for keeping employees like Samantha in check, and he had done nothing. Alexander's jaw tightened. That would change. He picked up his phone and made a call. "This is Carter," he said. "Shut the hotel down for a full-scale audit effective immediately." A pause. "Yes," he confirmed, his voice cold now. "I want every complaint reviewed, every guest compensated, every employee reevaluated." He hung up. Then he smiled to himself. By the time this was over, Samantha and Richard would regret ever thinking they could get away with this. This was just the beginning. The moment Alexander Carter hung up the phone, he knew the night was far from over. His fingers hovered over his laptop's keyboard as he scrolled through the Evergrand Manhattan's internal reports. What he found only fueled his growing fury. Samantha Blake wasn't just an incompetent employee. She was a repeated offender. There were dozens of complaints linked to her name: ignoring guests at check-in, canceling confirmed reservations, providing poor service based on a guest's appearance, using fabricated hotel policies to turn away customers. Yet, despite the sheer number of documented incidents, she was still employed. Alexander exhaled, his expression dark. This wasn't just a bad employee problem, this was a management problem. And Richard Hale, the hotel manager, was at the center of it. Alexander snapped his laptop shut and stood up. Time to go hunting. When he walked back into the Evergrand Manhattan lobby, the atmosphere was completely different from earlier. Employees were whispering among themselves. The bellboy who had been adjusting his hat in the corner now stood stiffly, clearly sensing that something was about to go down. And at the front desk, Samantha was still right where he left her. She wasn't on her phone anymore, though. No, she was rigid, her fingers clenched into fists at her sides. She knew she had been caught. She just didn't know how badly. Alexander walked up to the counter, placing both hands flat on the polished surface. "Samantha," he said smoothly. She jumped slightly, eyes flicking up to meet his. Her nervousness was barely concealed. Yes, sir," she said, her voice wavering slightly. He let the silence stretch just a little too long before he spoke again. "I have one question for you," he said, keeping his voice low and cold. Samantha gulped. "Oh, okay." Alexander pulled out his secondary phone, the one with full access to the hotel's internal system. He tapped the screen once, then turned the phone around, showing it to her. The display, her name, right next to the log that said, "Reservation manually deleted, Samantha Blake." She turned ghost white. "Can you explain this?" Alexander asked. Samantha's mouth opened and closed, but no words came out. Her fingers twitched as if trying to come up with a lie. I don't. Don't lie to me," Alexander cut her off coldly. She flinched. By now, the entire front desk staff had gone silent. Even guests sitting in the lounge area had started paying attention. Samantha swallowed hard. It must have been a system error. "Really," Alexander said smoothly, "because I checked. The system doesn't make errors like this. You do." She visibly panicked now, her eyes darting around as if searching for an escape. Look, I didn't mean to. I mean, it wasn't personal." Alexander leaned in slightly, his presence commanding. "You didn't mean to," he echoed. "Because from where I'm standing, it looks like you deliberately erased my reservation and then assigned me the worst room in the hotel." Samantha's lip trembled. She was out of excuses, and he wasn't done yet. Alexander straightened up and turned to a nearby employee. "Where's your manager?" he asked. The young clerk, barely in his 20s, stiffened. Mr. Hale." He stammered. He's in his office, sir." Alexander nodded once. "Tell him to come out here, now." The clerk scurried away, disappearing down the hallway. Samantha, who had been frozen in place, suddenly came back to life. "Sir, Alexander held up a hand, silencing her instantly. "We'll talk when Richard gets here." Samantha looked like she was about to faint. Less than 2 minutes later, Richard Hale emerged from the hallway. He was a middle-aged man with graying hair, wearing a slightly wrinkled suit that suggested he was neither as put together nor as sharp as he should be. His gait was hesitant. He already knew something was wrong. The moment he saw Alexander standing at the desk, his eyes widened. "Mr. Carter," he blurted. Alexander tilted his head. "Ah," he said lightly. "So you do recognize me. That's interesting." Richard's face turned pale. I wasn't expecting." "No," Alexander interrupted. "You weren't. But let's talk about why I'm here, shall we?" Richard swallowed hard. "Sir, Alexander raised his phone again. "Your employee," he said, nodding toward Samantha, "deleted my reservation and then assigned me the worst room in the building." Richard whipped around to face Samantha. "Is this true?" Samantha looked utterly petrified. I didn't." "She did," Alexander confirmed flatly. Richard looked like he wanted to collapse into the floor. Sir, this is unacceptable, I assure you." Alexander wasn't done. "Oh, I agree," he said. "But here's my real question, Richard. Why is she still employed?" Richard's mouth opened, but no words came out. Alexander continued, his tone growing colder. "I did my research. Samantha has a long list of complaints attached to her name, and yet every time nothing was done." Richard's hands trembled slightly. I thought she just needed more training." Alexander let out a short laugh. "Oh no," he said. "This isn't a training issue, this is a management issue." Richard visibly paled. Alexander took a slow step closer to Richard. "I'm giving you two options," he said, his voice now icy. Richard stiffened. "One," Alexander continued, "you fire her right now in front of everyone." Samantha gasped. "Or two," Alexander said, deadly calm, "I fire both of you." Richard's face drained of color. Samantha let out a strangled "Wait." "Decide," Alexander ordered. For a split second, Richard hesitated. Then he turned to Samantha and said the words she never expected to hear. "You're fired." Samantha froze. Her mouth opened in a silent protest, but nothing came out. Alexander watched, expression unreadable, as the reality of the situation crashed down on her. This wasn't a misunderstanding. This wasn't a warning. This was the end of her career. Samantha staggered backward, her face pale. The lobby had gone completely silent. Alexander turned back to Richard. "Good," he said. "Now, Richard," Richard flinched, "we need to talk about your future." The lobby remained eerily silent as the weight of Alexander Carter's words settled over the stunned employees and guests. Samantha Blake, the once smug receptionist, stood frozen in place, her eyes darting between Alexander and Richard Hale. Her breathing was shallow, her hands trembling as if she couldn't fully process what had just happened. She had been fired, in front of everyone, and yet the storm was far from over. Alexander turned his sharp gaze back to Richard, who still looked like a man standing on the edge of a cliff. The hotel manager had barely managed to fire Samantha without falling apart, but he still clung to the desperate hope that this was where it ended. He was wrong. Richard cleared his throat, forcing an awkward chuckle. "Mr. Carter," he said hesitantly, straightening his tie, "I assure you I had no idea Samantha was acting this way." "If I had known," Alexander cut him off. "That's exactly the problem, Richard," he said, his voice deadly calm. "You had no idea what was happening in your own damn hotel." Richard paled, sweat forming at his brow. "Sir, I can fix this. I promise you I'll personally oversee a complete overhaul of our staff training." Alexander took one step forward, his imposing presence shutting down whatever excuse Richard had been about to make. "Fix this?" Alexander echoed. "Tell me, Richard, how long has Samantha been working here?" Richard hesitated. 3 years, sir." 3 years," Alexander repeated, nodding slowly. "And in that time, how many complaints has she received?" Richard visibly gulped. "Well, I don't have the exact number, but—" Alexander held up his phone and tapped the screen. 42. The number hung in the air like a death sentence. Richard's eyes widened. "Yes, sir, 42 documented complaints from guests about her behavior," Alexander continued coldly. "And that doesn't include the staff complaints about her toxicity toward coworkers." Richard opened his mouth, then shut it again. There was nothing he could say. Alexander took another step forward, his eyes locked onto Richard like a predator cornering its prey. "You should have fired her a long time ago," Alexander said, his voice lower now, sharper. "Instead, you let this hotel become a customer service nightmare." Richard visibly shrank under the weight of Alexander's judgment. "Mr. Carter, please," he tried again, his voice wavering. "I can fix this." "I can," Alexander's patience snapped. "You are the problem, Richard," he thundered. The entire lobby flinched. Even Samantha, who had been paralyzed in shock, took an involuntary step backward. Alexander straightened his jacket, his next words cutting through the silence like a blade. "You failed. Not just today, not just with Samantha. You have allowed this hotel to rot from the inside out." Richard's hands trembled. I didn't realize. "And that's exactly why you're unfit to manage this hotel," Alexander said coolly. Richard looked like he was about to collapse. "Mr. Carter," he begged now, stepping forward, "please, I need this job. I've been here for 15 years. This hotel is my life." Alexander's expression didn't change. "And yet you treated it like an afterthought." Richard's breathing grew erratic. "Yes, sir, his voice cracked. "Please, I have a family." Alexander's jaw tightened. He had heard that line before, too many times from men who let power make them lazy. The problem wasn't that Richard didn't care. The problem was that he had never cared enough. For years, guests had been mistreated. Employees had been ignored. Complaints had been swept under the rug. And Richard had let it happen. The weight of his failure was undeniable. Alexander exhaled slowly. "You'll find another job, Richard," he said flatly, "just not at Evergrand." Richard's face crumbled. "Please, you're fired." The words landed like a hammer. Richard staggered back, his face ashen. The staff gasped, some covering their mouths in shock. A guest at the lounge whispered loudly to his companion. This was real. The hotel manager was gone. Alexander turned to a nearby assistant manager, a young woman who had been watching the entire spectacle unfold in stunned silence. "What's your name?" Alexander asked. The woman blinked, then straightened. "Cassandra, sir." Alexander nodded. "You're the acting manager now." Cassandra's eyes widened. "Me." "You," Alexander confirmed. "And if you don't want to end up like Richard, you'll start running this hotel the way it was meant to be run." "Understood." She swallowed hard and nodded quickly. "Good," Alexander said. He turned back to Richard. "You have 5 minutes to gather your things and leave," he said without emotion. Richard looked as if he might faint, but there was nothing left to say. The former manager turned, shoulders slumped, and walked toward his office to collect his belongings. Samantha still stood frozen, her eyes glassy with shock. Alexander turned to her one last time. "Security will escort you out," he told her. A tall, uniformed security guard immediately stepped forward. Samantha let out a weak, broken laugh. "You can't be serious." Alexander's expression was unreadable. "Goodbye, Samantha." And with that, he walked away. The entire lobby was still buzzing after the double firing. The guests were whispering excitedly, some taking subtle photos, knowing they had just witnessed something historic. The employees, they were silent, but their eyes told the story. Some were shocked, some were scared, and some looked relieved, because for the first time in years, someone had finally cleaned house. Alexander Carter strode toward the elevators, not looking back. The hotel wasn't fixed yet, but it would be, because he wasn't done, not by a long shot. The scent of tension still lingered in the air as Alexander Carter strode through the Evergrand Manhattan lobby. The echoes of the double firing of Samantha Blake and Richard Hale were still fresh, and the remaining employees stood stiffly behind the front desk, waiting for the next bomb to drop. For years, Evergrand Manhattan had been a festering wound in his empire. hidden behind 5-star ratings and carefully curated marketing. But now it was time to tear the rot out at the roots. Alexander stopped at the center of the lobby and pulled out his phone. The moment he hit dial, a crisp voice answered on the other end. "Evergrand Corporate, this is Linda speaking." "It's Carter," he said, voice firm. "Shut down Evergrand Manhattan." There was a sharp intake of breath from the employees nearby. "Effective immediately," he continued. "No new check-ins. Current guests will be compensated for the inconvenience and rebooked at our sister properties." Linda didn't hesitate. "Understood, sir. How long will the shutdown last?" "As long as it takes," Alexander said coldly. "I want a full-scale audit, top to bottom. Staff evaluations, guest experience reports, security footage analysis. Every customer complaint over the last 3 years needs to be reviewed." More hushed gasps. Alexander didn't acknowledge them. He was already moving toward the front desk. The young receptionist, Cassandra, the one he had promoted as acting manager just minutes earlier, looked as though she might faint. "Yes, sir, what should I?" "Make the announcement," Alexander instructed. "Inform all guests personally. They'll be getting VIP accommodations elsewhere." Cassandra swallowed hard and nodded quickly. "Yes, sir." She grabbed the desk phone, her voice barely steady as she spoke through the intercom system. "Attention all guests. This is an urgent announcement. Evergrand Manhattan will be temporarily closing for corporate review. Please proceed to the concierge for rebooking assistance. We sincerely apologize for any inconvenience." A wave of murmurs swept through the lobby. Guests looked around, confused, some approaching the front desk for clarification. Alexander watched their reactions carefully. Most of them seemed confused but not angry. In fact, some looked satisfied, because they knew something had been wrong. And now they saw someone was finally fixing it. The employees, however, were a different story. As soon as Alexander stepped away from the desk, he heard them whispering in frantic tones. "Wait, did she just say corporate review? This means we're all being evaluated, doesn't it? Shut down. What if I lose my job?" Then one of them said it out loud. "That's Alexander Carter." Dead silence. The name hung in the air like a guillotine. Several employees went pale. The young bellboy who had been standing near the concierge took an instinctive step backward. A housekeeper gripping her supply cart suddenly looked like she wanted to disappear. Everyone had assumed Alexander was some wealthy guest with a bad attitude. But now they realized the truth. The man they had ignored, dismissed, or quietly watched as he was mistreated was none other than the owner of the entire empire. And now, he was here to burn it to the ground and rebuild it. Alexander continued issuing orders without missing a beat. "All guests will receive full refunds for their stay," he told Cassandra, who was now frantically scribbling notes. "And I want all customers who have filed complaints in the past year to receive an official apology from corporate, along with complimentary VIP status for their next visit." Cassandra blinked. "VIP status for all of them." "All of them," Alexander confirmed. "We're not just repairing the hotel. We're repairing our reputation." More nervous shuffling among the employees. This wasn't just a temporary fix. This was a full-blown overhaul. The next step was cleaning house. "We'll be conducting individual performance evaluations for every staff member," Alexander continued. "Anyone who was complicit in mistreatment, anyone who actively ignored customer concerns, they're gone." The whispers in the lobby grew louder. Some employees visibly stiffened. Others shifted uncomfortably, casting glances at their colleagues. The guilty ones knew who they were. Alexander's next words came calm but unyielding. "And anyone who wants to walk away now before the audit starts can do so." Silence. For a long moment no one moved. Then 2 employees near the elevator exchanged glances. Without a word they turned on their heels and walked out. A third followed, then a fourth. The lobby remained dead silent. Alexander let them go. Cowards. If they weren't willing to stay and prove they deserved their jobs, they had no place in his empire. After a few moments, Alexander spoke again. To those of you who remain, he looked over the remaining employees, measuring their reactions. You have one opportunity to show me why you deserve to keep working at Evergrand. Some nodded quickly, eager to prove themselves. Others looked pale but determined. A select few simply looked guilty. Alexander didn't need to say anything else. By the time the audit was finished, they'd be gone too. As the final guest was escorted out and the last employee left the lobby for the night, Alexander took a slow breath. The Evergrand Manhattan was no longer operational. For now. But soon. It would be better than ever, because this was no longer just another hotel in his chain. This was a statement. Disrespect, gone. Incompetence, purged. Mediocrity, not an option. He had built this empire from nothing. And if he had to tear it apart and rebuild it from the ground up, so be it. Evergrand wasn't just going to recover, it was going to become the gold standard. Starting now. Leadership isn't about sitting in an office. It's about being in the trenches, knowing your business inside and out, and making tough decisions when necessary. A company's success is directly tied to how it treats its customers. One bad employee can ruin a brand's reputation, but poor management allowing bad employees to thrive is even worse. A failing business is usually not because of one bad employee. It's because of poor leadership allowing failures to persist. Great leaders recognize when managers are part of the problem and act accordingly. If a business doesn't constantly evaluate and improve itself, it will inevitably decline. Organizations that don't evolve become obsolete. Fear might enforce rules, but true leadership earns respect. The best companies don't run on fear. They run on inspiration, accountability, and clear expectations. Every business will face challenges, but those that survive are the ones that admit their faults, take responsibility, and fix the issues quickly. If you want to build an empire, you must create an environment where only excellence thrives, and let those who don't meet the standard eliminate themselves. This story wasn't just about firing bad employees, it was about rebuilding an empire. Alexander didn't purge incompetence for revenge. He did it because he knew his brand deserved better. Customers deserved better. Employees who truly worked hard deserved to be in a company where excellence was rewarded. By the end of the story, Evergrand Manhattan wasn't just saved, it was reborn. And that's what separates a CEO from a true leader. Great leaders don't just fire, they transform.